So to continue in the vein of Marx, we talked a little bit about his economic theory, but now let's talk about some of his assumptions in philosophy. Namely, where did Marx get these bad ideas from? Of course, there's many. I'm going to just isolate a little bit. And I'm going to try to put together also, again, in smaller videos, all of these current ideas that we see in intersectional theory and critical theory and all that stuff, and sort of where they came from. They all have a Marxist lineage. It's around that time. But let's isolate Marx in specific, because his ideas, first of all, when he published the Communist Manifesto, it was 1848. This is the state of play in 1848. You might see Germany in particular, but all of Eastern and a good chunk of Western Europe are in amazing turmoil. These are the revolutions of 1848. I mean, they were happening absolutely everywhere. Now, of course, when he wrote his, I put a little crosshairs here, he was nice, tucked away in Belgium, where nothing was happening. Nice and safe. So his take on these things was removed via publications of the day, if you would. He wasn't experiencing them firsthand, barely. And I might have included this quote before, but Mikhail Bakunin was a great philosopher in Russia, and eventually he met Marx, and his words for Marx were, as far as learning was concerned, Marx was and still is incomparably more advanced than I. I knew nothing at that time of political economy. I had not yet rid myself of my metaphysical observations. Now, this might seem like a straightforward statement, but it is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, meaning he was more of an idealist, and Marx displayed none of that. But he continues. He called me a sentimental idealist, and he was right. I called him a vain man, perfidious and crafty, and I also was right. I think that really encapsulates Marx's personality. It was definitely, I don't know, it was the intellectual con job. Bakunin goes on to describe this concept that he very, very nicely gisted of Marx, what he meant by his theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, was this idea of the new class. And the new class was those class of intellectuals that represented the proletariat, because the proletariat wasn't capable of representing itself. It didn't have the class conscience. It didn't have the learning. The later term that Marx will use is Lumpenproletariat, which is sort of the, I mean, you know, in English we say when we call someone a lump, that kind of describes itself, but the unthinking masses, basically. In any case, where did he get these bad ideas? We'll isolate it to, first and foremost, this wonderful gentleman in England, Thomas Robert Malthus. He was a professor that taught at the East India Company College. And again, this is yet another beautiful example of that Dunning-Kruger effect of not necessarily understanding production, not understanding how carrying capacity works and how agriculture works and all that stuff. And upon his observations, he commented that having observed a cycle in which England had a particularly bountiful harvest, those resources were very quickly eaten up by the people, and in their plenty, they basically procreated, created more people, which then needed more resources, and that basically got him on this line of thinking of the Malthusian trap, and you'll hear that even today. And that really preoccupied the minds of the philosophers of that time, coming into the Industrial Revolution. So mind you, he expressed this roughly at the turn of the century, and then as the century took off, this was sort of in the textbooks already. The idea that the Malthusian trap was just about to snap, and it was a horrible idea because, first of all, it's a complete misunderstanding of the idea of carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is what the surrounding lands are able to yield in terms of being able to support the surrounding population. And while on one hand it's understandable, because although he lived in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what had not yet happened was the mechanization and sort of the chemical advancements that would completely revolutionize agriculture. But rather than looking at innovation as being the solution of a trap, because invariably this has been a pattern of history. Whenever populations grew to a certain extent, whenever we, sort of concentrated into cities, more and more advancements in agriculture made way and created the resources necessary for the bigger populations. Not having that clue, he very much pictured a world of scarcity, meaning the resources were finite and people were growing. Therefore, things were bound to run out. Now, if you take a minute and you sort of firm that up in your head, you can see how it can lead to a ton of bad ideas, a ton of just really hateful concepts. Because the very direct evolution of scarcity, the way we speak of it in the modern times, is what we refer to as the zero-sum game, meaning the pie is fixed and everything else, you're just trying to slice different slices. There's no idea of being able to grow a bigger pie, zero-sum game. That's applicable in, for example, when you have fixed budgets or when you have a fixed amount of resources, but in general, it isn't applicable to the wider world. But this led to a series of many more monumentally bad ideas. A phrase you might hear today, typically used by conspiracy theorists, but it had its flow in England. The idea of the useless eaters. And of course, that sounds pretty much like, that means pretty much like what you think it means, the way it sounds. It's the idea that there's a certain group of people whose contribution does not outweigh their consumption. Therefore, they're just here eating, and not providing their fair share in return. So the implication being that, we'd best just kind of get rid of them. Which, of course, if you evolve that a little more, starts really pounding home these ideas of justification of class. So, well, obviously there's a reason why this class is so much more advanced, because look at how wonderful they are and they provide for the world, blah, 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 blah. So the idea really served to cement these concepts that later on led to, guess what? Eugenics, race, purity kind of thoughts in Hitler. All of these just pathological thoughts that came down all came from good old Mr. Malthus. And his error, it wasn't that he was necessarily an evil person. His error was just he was looking at he was resource output centric. He had no concept of the inputs, and therefore he could only judge the results, couldn't judge the process. Now, it turns out that about 100 years later, he's completely proven wrong by one Fritz Haber, who created the Haber process. At that time, Europe was nearing its carrying capacity, and there was quite a bit of a scare because of some unrest and some issues that basically prevented Europe from being able to import guano, I believe it was the fertilizer of the time. And there was a real concern that, many of Europe's citizens might starve. And so he went off in a room and created the process by which we now craft ammonia from nitrogen, and was able to chemically produce a vast variety of fertilizers, and got the Nobel Prize for it. On the flip side, he also was the father of chemical warfare. He created mustard gas, and eventually, I believe, killed himself because he was conflicted. He was a Jewish man in Hitler's Germany and didn't think that he perhaps lived up to his mission. So In any case, a Nobel Prize winner for saving the world from famine, who also created chemical warfare. So there's a contradiction. So that's one idea. Zero-sum game. Keep that one in mind. Now, Kant. Hands down one of the best philosophers that Europe had. However, he was extremely fluid in his writing, but at the same time, he was very much accused of being what's called obscurant. He sort of directly out of hand dismissed, philosophy cannot be based upon mathematics. And so he tended to take these sort of jumps in logic and not show his work, so to speak. So he would have a lot of assertions in his philosophy and not necessarily justify them, which led to a series of things that were somewhat logically unsound, but were attractive when he stated them. But when left there and when amplified by time with the importance that eventually Kant will receive within the pantheon of philosophers, encouraged others to continue to modify them towards that negative direction, and it leads to a cascade of just erroneous, brain-breaking type thinking. So his fundamental struggle was he was lamenting morality. I mean, this is obviously a common topic coming off of the age of enlightenment and reason. Eventually, it culminates in Nietzsche's, death of God. But this concept of this promise of a morality that is no longer moored in religion, but moored in reason, and everyone was trying to take a stab at it, as was he. And what he came up with was with the kategorische Imperative, the categorical imperative, this idea of a transcendent ethic, a transcendent morality. The deontological ethics, so the taking apart of existing ethics, and yet somehow he asserts that one must act from duty, which was interesting because in his same argument he wants to take apart all of the historical definition of morality. So where does duty come from? Not listed. Also introduces this other concept of cultural relativism, which is a deadly one, and I'll get into further detail on that. And of course, kritische philosophy, which is critical philosophy. For the first time, he decides that the philosopher's job isn't to observe, it isn't to analyze, it is to drive change, it is to criticize what he sees in the world. And in many respects, you can kind of see that kind of meant well. I mean, he's lived in a time of turmoil. America, in his lifetime, America has seen its independence. France had seen its days of the terror, and so there's been a lot of turmoil in Europe. And actually, when he died, there was turmoil, quite a bit of turmoil, because Napoleon was running roughshod all over Europe. And as the industrial age was taking off, I think he could see that there's some possibility for injustice, but fundamentally he was just trying to identify that which is the moral transcendency, something that should apply to us all. But in doing so, he took some very reasonably sounding topics, and as we'll go through them, you'll see that they can lead to a complete negation of logic. Now, of course, Hegel was his follower, if you would. And we'll get to Hegel in a second, because we need to step back to the Greek philosopher before we explain what Hegel got wrong. But here are the three basically bad idea seeds. One is his cultural relativism, Kant's, led to moral relativism. Now let's explain relativism for a second. It started from Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Newton. Eventually it gets refined all the way down to Einstein. It's a physics concept, and it is a mathematical concept. It is pretty rigid, but it sounds, philosophers love stuff like this, that can be sort of, when turned into a word problem, it sounds very insightful and deep. The the simple observation that Galileo had, and then Tycho Brahe and also Newton, was that when you want to measure, lots of them were involved in measuring the precession of every orbit of every planet and how much of the arc they swept and what the frequency was and the speed. They were trying to determine sort of the underlying, basically the celestial mechanics of the planet. So they were very meticulous in this. And one of the caveats that they observed, rightfully, was that, well, depending on which point you want to measure from, your measurement to a given point will depend on your perspective. So meaning if you're standing on the Earth and the Earth is moving and you're attempting to measure your distance from here to, say, Venus, you need to take into account that you are in an inertial frame. You're a moving frame of reference, and so is Venus. So as you proceed to take that measurement at different times, you have to take the point of view, the perspective into account. Similarly, if looked at it from a different direction, from a different angle, from a different planet, perhaps, the angles will be different, the distances will seem different, etc. So that measurement will be different. Now, on the surface, you can interpret this, as the philosophers did, as well. There's an infinite relative points of view. There's an infinite number of perspectives. Therefore, any given truth can have an infinite number of interpretations. And that's precisely what that doesn't say, which is every time you switch the point of perspective, there's a transformation that has to take place. There's a little formula you have to apply to get it back to the objective truth. That part's left out because that part's in the more complex math. So it simply gets described by Kant as, well, who are we to judge a different culture? I mean, this is a concept you hear today, cultural relativism. Moral relativism also seems to creep up once in a while, but only when someone's trying to accuse somebody else of moral relativism, as if their morals are somehow absolute and everybody else's are, crap. But that is exactly what this thing brings in. This relativism, in effect, negates not culture, not moral, but it negates truth. Because if whatever it is that you hold as true, and that's usually very critical for morals, per se, if whatever you hold as true is only one of an infinite number of interpretations, then why would you privilege one over the other? And if none are privileged over the other, then none are fundamentally true, because you can't privilege any of them. And that is one of those divide by zero errors that allows you to argue anything with impunity, because nothing is true anymore. There's no such thing as objective truth. Therefore, any wild idea, by there being no truth, it also gives you everything being true. So in effect, you can just blatantly argue any absurd point because you can follow the same steps by using moral relativism to prove as you would any other truth. And that's a problem. Now, that's not a problem that is immediately detected, but most definitely Hegel begins to scratch at it, and then Marx scratches at it, and by the time it makes it to our days in terms of critical theory and intersectionalism, it is a complete and utter brain-breaking virus. The second thing was critical theory. Critical theory was, again, Kant's urge that philosophers be a bit more, I guess, activist. They shouldn't simply observe, they should critique. Now, up till now, the philosopher's role was to observe the world and attempt to make sense of it, not to give their own subjective view. And this is what he introduces there, this idea of subjectivity. And he sort of kind of throws it in softer terms, but it's a bit similar to today's critical theory, which is in an effort to make a better world. So therefore, social justice, right? So look at it from the perspective of social justice. He doesn't say exactly that, but he says, if you're familiar with the saying that history is written by the victors, he begins to introduce the idea that, well, what we have as surviving documents were written by a certain faction or a certain group of people with a certain outlook, with a certain society, with a certain morality. Therefore, that infests their writing. And what you should try to do is basically take this higher, more rational, our better view of history and apply that as opposed to their ancient, misguided view of history. So whereas what you have is, the first, the original records, instead of interpreting the words as they are on the page, you're meant to interpret them as you, with your advanced morality, should interpret them. And you can see how that begins to introduce a whole bunch of problems. Because at the same time, the roots of your morality, the roots of what your understanding is, the roots of this advanced point of view from the future, comes from the very same texts, comes from the very same roots, the same springs of the same founts of knowledge as the texts, right? They are the founts of knowledge are the texts. So whatever you believe your advanced morality to be, it came from there. Therefore, you're sort of being asked to reinterpret your source with criteria that came from your source, but as if they're alien from your source. So it just creates a distortion of what necessarily was meant on paper, and all of a sudden you have all of these reinterpretations, and sort of doubtful views, etc. That's where you begin to see, whereas up till now historians were just simply believed or at least not commented upon. All of a sudden you see a lot of commentary about, Apollodorus is known to have exaggerated here, and it's probably, so there's always these assertions that the historian just believes through his authority that, well, this is most likely an exaggeration. This is most likely not true. This is most likely only trying to make this party look good or that party look bad. You begin to get the equivalent of the op-ed in historical and philosophical analysis. Now, good old Hegel. And for that, we'll step forward, or backwards rather, I should say, in time. Now, if there's one basis for the tools of thinking, it starts with the Greek and the Socratic method. The Greeks were big on teaching grammar, which was basically the mechanics of words and how to put them together. Logic, the ability to structure sentences and understand how things fit and how prepositions fit with arguments, etc. And then rhetoric, the idea of composing such sentences and being able to orate them and have dialogue. Amongst the very first of the ones to sort of jot down the structure of an argument per se, and then also separately how to teach students to properly debate and argue, was Plato with his Socratic method, his stories about Socrates. So the Socratic method is pretty simplistic. It's also called a dialect. It's a method that can be applied in two ways. One is dialectic, meaning a dialogue, or analytic, meaning you dialogue yourself. So you interpret it and you sort of put your counter thoughts within your own head to the proposition. But let's focus on the dialectic. The argument, also known as the thesis, is put forward. And then one or more what are known as interlocutors, they each present a counter-argument called an elenchus, or elenchi for plural. This would be a counter-proposition, a testing proposition, a derivation, any sort of, and there's a variety of counter-arguments you can structure. The Romans get very detailed about this, and you'll see all of the argumentum ad whatever, all of the various methods you are allowed and not allowed to debate. Each counter then is considered by the proponent and is responded to if he can. And the goal there isn't necessarily a goal to it. It's not a dunking on type of contest. It's to cause the holder of the thesis to reach a state of aporia, which is puzzlement, deep contemplation. So whereas you've been caused to think about your topic deeper, ideally you're completely unable to respond and you have to go off and think about it at a greater length and then bring it back again. So there is not a definite requirement for a victory, for an end, for a final point. And that's fundamentally the difference. It's the process that allows you to see that smaller truths. So these counter-arguments, the elenchi, are themselves truths being, positioned to attack your proposition. And as they survive or not survive, it's sort of the smaller truths fall away to reveal the underlying wisdom. And it's the process that it's what the teaching, what the gist of the teaching is. And then separately from these, but connected, were the concept of Socratic circles, which were just variants in the structure of this debate. You could have more than one presenter, more than one counter interlocutor. You could also have other participants in inner and outer circles, meaning, they're on your team or on the counter team, and they can either comment, they can help you, they can comment on the topic themselves, amongst themselves, or they can critique the oration skill. How much pathos are you using, logos, ethos, how much emotion, how much knowledge, and how much command of the language. So this, as you can see, it's kind of a broad, multivariant kind of approach, right? It didn't have any sort of hard rails by which you had to follow. Well, Hegel decided that he's going to retcon this. So first, he basically creates this, as you might have heard of the Hegelian dialectic. This concept of a thesis is presented, and the natural antithesis makes itself known, and eventually, through the conflict, it gets settled into a synthesis, which is theoretically one outcome. I mean, that is possibly a resolution, but it implies that a resolution is possible. It implies that a resolution is forthcoming. It implies that the antithesis is a direct opposition of the thesis, and hardly any argument is like that. But it creates a nice little structure, and Hegel was very fond of these sort of deep-sounding, simplistic things, The other commentary he has is Geist as phenomenology, the feel of the times, basically looking at observing what he sees instead of deducing. So it's a sort of abdication from trying to diagnose the problems. It's just observing the problems and accepting them as valid. And the other problem, and this is by far the more sinful of the concepts that he introduces this context to the dialectic. One must interpret any sort of such a dialectic in the context of the master and slave relationship. This begins this context of oppression that you'll see repeated from Marx on out. And the idea is that any given relationship is a relationship of power. And one person is the master, one person is the slave. And of course, being Hegel, he likes to take things to the circuitous route to end right back. So it's the master is the one that must be observed. The slave does the observation. Yet, after a while, the slave observes the master dutifully so much that the master requires that the slave exist. So there comes a point where the master needs the slave more than the slave needs the master. So it's this circuitous thing about like, hey, look, you can follow this logic and get all the way back to the beginning and contradict yourself. He was fond of these one-hand clapping type of statements. Now, on the flip side, he was still religious. So he still attempted to kind of cast things in a... He hadn't been able to shed religion, but he, again, had the same challenge as Kant. He was trying to look for that unmoored morality. The problem, the real problem with Hegel was that whereas Kant was a pretty crisp writer and very fluid and very, expressive, Hegel was torturous. So whereas Kant was obscurant because he just simply asserted and didn't show his work, Hegel was obscurant like Kant, and on top of that, layer onto this Byzantine sort of sentence framing. And it is entirely possible that Hegel might have been an idiot, but his writing was so torturous and this idea of critical interpretation that eventually, and more intelligent people read his writings and read into it 20,000 meanings that may or may not exist. Now, I'm halfway joking, but suffice it to say, during his career, he had more detractors than he had supporters. And in fact, most of his detractors felt that he shouldn't be allowed to hold a teaching position. They felt that his ideas were basically toxic to that level. So these are just 2 to 3 sources for Marx. So from this point, Marx has moral relativism, which is basically the ability to just chuck all truth out, the ability to basically reinterpret any single historical stance that he can read, because you can just interpret it through a certain context. And of course, because Hegel handily gives him this master-slave oppression narrative, Marx comes out with his dialectic. It isn't the Hegelian dialectic, it is the Marxist, the materialistic dialectic, which is, let's interpret the world through how much stuff you have. And if you have stuff, that means you got it from someone, and that means you're a bad person. That means that the person who was oppressed, he's the good person, you're the bad person, and therefore we need to shuffle everything around. I'm exaggerating, I'm oversimplifying, but you'll notice that the oppression narrative continues from this point on. Critical theory, I'll talk about that in another segment, but critical theory is, again, a plague on all of our thinking. And then, of course, moral relativism, when you can't have objective truth, and when you're allowed to divide by zero in your problems, you're going to blow up your calculator. So that's it. If you like it, comment. Thanks.